Happy holidays! Today I've got a game to really help you get into the festive spirit, a forgotten Ukrainian FPS, Cryostasis Sleep of Reason. There's really not many Christmassy games out there. Most people settle for games that satisfy the Christ part of Christmas, so I'm settling for the mass part of Christmas. Mass as in massive amounts of snow? Well, hey, game's 90% snow, so therefore it's 90% in the Christmas spirit. The rest 10% is those snow zombie axe murderers and the PPSH 41 dual-wielding half-trained juggernauts, who are probably those ancient pagan influences kicking in? I don't know. Anyways, Cryostasis is a slow-paced action horror FPS with an Arctic theme. When starting my blind playthrough, I expected Condemned Criminal Origins if it was set in the Arctic. There's a bit of that, but Cryostasis is its own janky, half-functional duct-taped-together beast. I primarily heard it was a melee brawler, but that's only true early on, as it gives way to a strong focus on guns as it goes along. It's also extremely slow-paced, a slow burn in every imaginable way. It's certainly not for everyone. The things Cryostasis does well, it's almost in its own league. The things it does badly, however, are pretty embarrassing. I look back on Cryostasis and remembered a fantastic atmosphere, only to then remember the remarkably crappy combat. It is a definitive love-hate game for me, and I'm gonna be thinking about it for a very long time. It's the Druk QS by Aphex Twin of video games, where the ride is bumpy and uncomfortable, but I ultimately don't have any regrets going on the ride in the first place. So, let's begin. Well, actually, before I start talking about Cryostasis proper, I must mention the hurdles you need to jump through in order to play it. As of releasing this video, Cryostasis is abandonware. It's pretty appropriate that a game called Cryostasis is stuck in a software equivalent of Cryostasis. Much like Prey 2006, it was allegedly pulled due to some sort of licensing issues, though there's no jukebox appended on this time. I don't like outright naming my sources, so I'll only say that I found a functional GOG copy of Cryostasis on a website known for being an archive organization. The GOG version is the ideal version, as it is DRM free, fully patched, and relatively easy to get running. Relatively. The Steam version utilizes an inferior build of the game, and physical copies are infected with Star Force, the DRM equivalent of rabies. Yeah, do yourself a favor and seek out the version that was formerly on GOG. But there's a lot more to playing Cryostasis than just acquiring it. Scarier than all of its actual horror elements is all of its technical issues. Honestly, I'm surprised I could even get it to run properly on Windows 10 since it is so infamously finicky. If you haven't noticed by now from my footage, Cryostasis is an absolutely monstrous game to run. It came out in 2008, yet humanity still hasn't invented hardware powerful enough to run it smoothly. Cryostasis was marketed towards EVGA and Nvidia cards, which were seemingly the only video card line it was remotely optimized for. My video card happens to be an EVGA Nvidia GeForce 1070, yet it still chugs on Cryostasis like the tugboat it takes place on. AMD users in particular get screwed over, as the game is allegedly almost unplayable on most AMD cards. It is astonishing that even though the game came out in 2008, I'm on medium settings, playing on vastly superior hardware, specifically a line of hardware that the game was originally optimized for, I'm still experiencing significant frame rate drops. In this regard, I've never seen anything else quite like Cryostasis. Even if it were to run well, which is completely hypothetical and probably won't happen in our lifetimes, you still have to be paranoid about crashes. Bethesda games are more stable on average than Cryostasis. It's most like Fallout 3, where the game is volatile to begin with, but it becomes increasingly more and more volatile the deeper you get into it. Level 14 in particular is especially bad, crashing almost once per minute. It got to the point where I thought I wasn't going to be able to beat the game thanks to how often it was crashing, but the video game equivalent of trying to force my head through a wall eventually managed to work, and the rest of the game after level 14 was smooth sailing. Even so, I'm among the lucky ones, since some people struggle to get past level 1 without frequent crashes. It's all seemingly dependent on your hardware, operating system, settings, horoscope, and the current moon phase. Mostly the last two. All you can really do is pray and try to prevent crashes in advance. I didn't troubleshoot for too long, but I found a small list of things that you can do to help. Running the game in compatibility mode for XP Service Pack 3, setting shaders to 3.0, disabling PhysX, and setting most of the graphical options to medium or lower. Allegedly, Cryostasis becomes violently unstable if you change your graphics options mid-playthrough. Hope you're committal. If you can get through the first level in one go with no crashes, then Cryostasis smiles upon you, and the experience should only be modestly bumpy for the most part. Even if this game is your cup of tea, there's no guaranteeing you'll actually be able to beat it, which is really unfortunate, but oh well, let's jump right in. Cryostasis shoos you into the snowshoes of Alexander Nestorov, a Russian meteorologist in the North Pole. He's intended to board a nuclear icebreaker known as the North Wind, but he discovers that something has gone horrifically wrong. The ship has been abandoned for over a decade and the crew have transformed into Arctic murder hobos, the rarest kind of murder hobos. After a big fall on his way to the ship, Nestorov uses his anime super move named Mental Echo to effectively resurrect himself from death. This ability allows him to view moments from previous points in time from the perspective of dead people, usually their final moments. It's effectively time travel since changes in the past will then apply to the present. He then enters a ship and begins using his newfound power to investigate what happened on board. Through this power, the occasional flashback, and notes scattered about, you get to slowly piece together the mystery of what happened on board the ship and whether or not you can prevent the disaster in the first place. The story's obviously laced with metaphors and themes, as you'd probably expect from an Eastern European game. It mirrors and quotes a fairy tale written by Maxim Gorky called Danko's Burning Heart, which I've never heard of before playing this game, though I'm more of a Philistine than most, so that may not mean much. Cryostasis has a rather interesting story told in a unique way, but it is an immensely slow burn. See, the first 30% of the game is dense with story, but then the next 60 or so percent is absurdly piecemeal, barely giving you table scraps most of the time. Then they realize they need to start answering questions and finishing the story in the final 10%, so it's somewhat clumsy and abrupt. It's simply paced out awkwardly. There is a good bit more to say about the story. I'm really glossing over a lot here, but it's not my usual forte, and most of what I can say would be in spoiler territory. The story is still something worth experiencing for yourself here, even if I do kind of spoil a lot of other surprises in the game. So I'll talk more about it later. For now, it's presentation time. Cryostasis is a game where there is a lot to be said about the presentation. It presents itself as a horror game with a cold twist. Being set entirely on a wrecked ship in the Arctic, you can expect it to be pretty cold. I love this setting by default. Next to Florida, the Arctic is one of the most uninhabitable places on Earth, so it seems like a great place to set a horror game. I always love the mystique behind the Arctic anyways. Who knows what's up there? Frozen mammoths, weird brain-eating bacteria, prehistoric Nazi gold, dudes dual-wielding PPS-841s. That mystery is half the fun. Plus, it's mighty appropriate that an ice-flavored game is held up well, though there's a lot more contributing to it staying fresh than it simulating the world's largest refrigerator. The particles look great, the environments look profoundly cold, and the ice and snow effects are stellar. I love the inclusion of icicles in the environment, which break apart in chunky and satisfying ways. You can kick their fragments around on the ground, which is pretty satisfying too. They're everywhere, so you get to experience this a lot. The snow is genuinely intimidating at times thanks to the dense particles, great sound work, and the fact that it can hurt you when it's intense enough. A small detail I really appreciate is that your character's breath is clearly visible in colder areas and less visible in warmer areas. Both the visual and game design make you attracted to warmth, so it's truly a Neanderthal brain game in some regards, though I personally like the aesthetics of cold areas more than the warm ones. They simply absolutely nailed the frozen Arctic atmosphere. The dynamic lighting, light shafts, and shadows also helped Cryostasis age like honey. The lighting work is well done from start to finish. I appreciate that many light sources bounce around when you shoot them. Cleverly, certain light sources double as healing, as I'll talk about shortly, so there's gameplay incentive to pay extra attention to light. It's often used sparingly and is typically an indicator of relative safety. Turning power on is a frequent objective in this game where the environment starts to light up and visibly warm up around you. This is an absurdly cool and unique effect. The icicles start dropping to the floor and the walls lose their frost effects on them. Simple but effective and memorable. On top of all of that, the general model, texture, and animation quality is superb for the time, though I'd suggest you don't look too closely. The animations can be a little janky at times too. If you had no prior knowledge of this game and I told you it was a middle market Ukrainian game released in 2008 running on medium settings, would you believe me? But as I mentioned before, Cryostasis has a plethora of technical issues, mainly in the form of framerate drops and crashes. For obvious reasons, this isn't good for a game that strives to be immersive. Crashing every 5 minutes would take anyone out of Cryostasis' carefully crafted atmosphere. That's a hard sentence to say. I should mention that a major way to prevent crashes is to disable physics, which was actually an advertising point of this game. I don't think its enhancements are really worth the severe instability though. There's an official physics on versus off comparison video on YouTube if you're interested. And there is another potential problem. Nearly the entire game takes place inside a nuclear icebreaker. In other words, most of the game takes place in icy metallic corridors. Now from what I could gather, the developers heavily studied a real nuclear icebreaker for these environments. I respect the effort and they did pushed the setting to its limits. The environments do look fantastic, but it left me wishing for the occasional detour away from the ship to mix things up. While there are frequent set pieces and unique segments, you never escape the icy metal corridors for long. Most color palette variety comes in the form of the mental echo sequences where you're in warmer metal corridors. The contrast is very welcome and helps keep things fresh. It's just a shame it's often restricted to interactive cutscenes. Cryostasis is also a dark and claustrophobic game, and I imagine the horror is largely playing off of that. I'm pretty resistant to horror, so I personally didn't find this game very scary. Not to say that there's not decent moment-to-moment tension wandering the desolate frozen corridors of the ship, but when it's going out of its way to be scary, it never landed for me. Cryostasis is heavy on cheap jump scares for my taste, with there being plenty of times where some axe or rifle guy just magically teleports right in front of you. The axe guys always killed me because there's never any way to see them coming, so they're basically just a sucker punch. I've really been racking my brain on how to word this, so here's the best I have. Cryostasis has Doom 3 syndrome. Like Doom 3, it really wants to be scary, but it makes the mistake letting you become a one-man wrecking crew. As a result, most of the spookiest moments are where you're more vulnerable in the early game, and when the developers can sporadically catch you off guard with a jump scare cheap shot. Cryostasis does keep you more vulnerable than Doom 3, especially thanks to its slow pace and more limited ammo, but once you get the PPSH-41, nothing's really scary anymore. Again, there is still a decent looming sense of tension. The atmosphere is superbly crafted, but it slowly loses its luster as you gain more means to fight Cryostasis' few horror tricks. Horror is subjective, so I guess all I have left to say here is that your mileage may vary. To close off this section, I should mention that the sound work is absolutely incredible. Cryostasis has shockingly good ambience and sound design. The creaking of the ship, the howling of the wind, the crumbling of ice, Nestorov breathing, the footsteps and cries of enemies, it's all great tension fuel. I consistently found the most unnerving and intense parts of the game to be in the sound design. If the game hinged on this more than its Dollar General jump scares, then I could see it very consistently getting under my skin. The sound effects in general are stellar, crisp, and satisfying, and the EAX directional audio, the way sounds resonate off the ship walls, that's a chef's kiss. The mixing is comfortable on average, it's just about everything feeling appropriately loud or quiet. Even though the gunplay in this game is pretty bad, I'll elaborate later, your guns have a genuine sense of power between their sounds and particle effects. I especially love the Mosin Nagant sound effects, it has some good oomph to it. Beyond the gunshot sounds, combat has a well done noisiness to it, with physics objects audibly being blown around in hectic gunfights and enemies loudly clanking, yelping, or stomping as bullets knock them around. I say this in the best way possible, this is good shit. I could really only think of two sounds I took issue with. The sound for punching because it's a little weak, and the sound for healing because it peaks hard when it echoes. Otherwise, Cryostasis, this janky, obscure 2008 shooter, casually nails sound design to the point where I'd confidently argue it's in the same league as the Dark Project or Alien Isolation. The fact that this game doesn't come up in the discussion of video games with good sound design is rather sad to me. I guess it's just a little bit too obscure. If there's one thing to take away from this video, it's that Cryostasis has top-notch presentation all around. Though on the other hand, I don't have too much to say about the voice acting or soundtrack. The voice acting is decent enough, nothing about it particularly stood out to me. Or in anything else, it's a matter there's no particularly memorable voice performances here. Likewise, the soundtrack is barely present. I don't think the game has any music beyond its main menu and credits. If there is music, it blends into the ambience very well. I guess it's up to you to decide whether or not that's a good or bad thing. Without much more to say, let's move on to the gameplay. Cryostasis has a uniquely presented health system. It's largely cosmetic, but I think it's a fun thematic spin on it. You have two effective health bars, one representing exterior temperature, another representing your internal temperature. Your internal temperature is your traditional health. Once you get too cold/eat too much shit, you die. Cold environments drain your exterior temperature, which in turn drains your interior temperature, depending on how specifically cold the area is. Most areas are cold, so your health is effectively always ticking down. You need to find heat sources in order to heal. Heat sources are infinitely reusable for the most part. Being in close proximity to them boosts your exterior temperature, and whatever the maximum net reaches is how much you can restore your interior temperature. Different heat sources offer variable amounts of heat with no real consistency or predictability, so you have to take them as they come. It takes time to heat up and you have no portable form of healing, so expect to be seeing this animation a lot. I should mention that while your interior temperature draining on its own may sound awful, it can't kill you. It's completely manageable, and the game is smart with its placement of heat sources. There's only a select few times where it starves you of heat, so there's no need to worry about freezing to death while exploring or entering a fight with little to no HP. Cryostasis is infamous for something aside from its technical problems, and that's its base movement speed. I can understand why someone would hate it. Calling it a snail's pace would almost be an insult to snails, yet it's fine. The level design is claustrophobic and the combat is slow-paced. There's nothing wrong with Cryostasis being slow-paced, because it embraces the slow pace. Sure, it's not ideal for dodging melee attacks or spiders, but it is completely serviceable for everything else. It especially doesn't get in the way of the atmosphere. If anything, the actual issue is the stamina meter, which refills slower than permafrost melts. It replenishes a billion times faster at a heat source, but a billion times a quintillionth is still only a billionth. Even if it did refill faster, sprinting is only about a 15% or so movement speed boost. That's not much when your default speed could reasonably be described as a leisurely strolling pace. It's not a big issue, honestly. It's just one of those cases where I wonder why they even bothered giving you a sprint button. Combat encounters thankfully don't ask for movement speed, and your brisk hobble is adequate for the slow moments of exploration between fights and cutscenes. Cryostasis qualifies as a linear corridor shooter. In fact, this is probably the least I've ever had to say about the general level design in a game on my channel. It's largely cramped, tight spaces with the occasional wide or slightly vertical arena. It's all inoffensive and fairly well paced, with a balanced mix of atmospheric sections, combat, and cutscenes. It's just that if you're in it for the action, the level design isn't going to wow you in any way. Cryostasis faces that dilemma that games based on real places tend to face, where accuracy to the location typically takes precedence over the level design being especially interesting or adventurous. I think that's what led to the atmospheric parts of Cryostasis sticking with me so well. It's a very rare game where the slow and quiet moments were usually more enjoyable than its intense action moments. So yes, the slow movement speed makes sense. It's also very cold, and I don't think you'd be moving very fast if you're in the Arctic wearing heavy Arctic survival gear. I don't know how much it would weigh, but you know, it's heavy. It's not good for moving around in. You want your heat. Yeah, whatever. As I mentioned earlier, this game has a feature called Mental Echo, where you can travel back in time into the perspective of someone else. It's usually a scripted set piece. They're well presented, they sometimes feature unique gameplay, and they play a major role in the story. I often like them as little mix-ups. Sometimes they are pseudo-interactive, railroaded cutscenes. Other times you're supposed to solve some kind of navigation or environmental puzzle within a short amount of time. This game is the first on my channel in a while to feature my oh-so-hated HEPS, which is more of a testament to my remarkably shitty upload schedule than anything else. HEPS is my personal shorthand for horrible environmental puzzles, which describes puzzles that usually amount to trial and error or luck rather than actual brain-busting puzzling. Not all of the puzzles in Cryostasis are like this. However, the bad puzzles are highly arbitrary and reminiscent of the roundabout ringer that old adventure games used to put you through. It's rare for them to communicate vital information to you, which is especially obnoxious since you're usually on a timer. The best you can often do is randomly interact with objects in the environment or follow the vague instructions NPCs give you. Let's look at some examples. How about the door puzzle early on in the game? You're put on a timer to open a door with multiple hinges. The game actually taught you how to do this previously with no time pressure, so this seems fair, except that's not actually what's happening, because you'll always fail if this is all you do. In this case, the solution to the puzzle is quite literally behind you. It's sheer misdirection. Another example is a puzzle to unlock the icicle cannon weapon. You find some guy dead from getting blasted in the face with glass, so you have to save him from inventing a new form of cosmetic surgery. The obvious solution seems to be exiting the room and hiding in the adjacent boiler room, but no, you automatically fail if you do that. What you're supposed to do is just crouch on the floor in the room you start in. I mean, it's theoretically a solution, but it's just not the obvious or logical one. Who knows how that glass is gonna fracture? Oh, and what about the polar bear puzzle? This deserves to go down in infamy. Possessing a polar bear is admittedly pretty funny, but the puzzle you're expected to do is unbelievably absurd. In this puzzle, you have to find a way to escape your cave while there's two Russians with guns outside. I figured you had to hide or try sneaking out. That doesn't work. What about pouncing the soldier who was scripted to enter the cave? Somehow, no. You're a polar bear, yet you instantly lose a fight against some random goober when you have the upper hand. Just wait it out? Nope, almost no matter what, you get slaughtered by the world's first Russian aimbots. What you're supposed to do is go up some icy steps concealed in the darkness, interact with this random indistinct Looney Tunes ice column at exactly the right time, wait a minute arbitrarily, and then you can sneak out. Even now, just thinking about it, this is an infuriatingly stupid puzzle. It requires you to know an exact sequence of events and exactly when to time your actions. There's a large number of possibilities to have to trial and error your way through here. I ruthlessly hate this crap, and I'm shocked they figured this out without a walkthrough in the first place. I haven't even mentioned the hep that takes place in a room with a rapidly strobing light, but for obvious reasons I shouldn't show it. I guess I've been slow to mention this, but if you're prone to seizures, you'd probably want to skip Cryostasis. The only real consolation you get with this game's puzzles is that you're booted back to the present very quickly with no load screen. The load screens are long, so this is saving you a profound amount of time. At least the developers are somewhat merciful. But that's enough rambling on this, I should get to the combat. Combat is something you'll be doing relatively often in Cryostasis, so it does need its own section. I'll start with the melee combat, which is special. I have a soft spot for first-person melee combat, as returning viewers probably know from my past discussion of games like Condemned and The Hunt. Well, Cryostasis features one of the most clumsy melee combat systems I've ever seen. It has a lot of surface-level glamour. Melee does have decent feedback outside of the somewhat light hit sound, and enemies are well animated. In addition, you can influence the direction of your strikes, swap between a small set of different melee weapons, and utilize a combo system. The only one of these three things that really matters is the combo system. I know it may sound like I'm making this up, but I promise I'm not joking here. To perform a combo, you just hold down any two movement keys at once and mash click. That's it. The dominant strategy is just to ferociously strafe walk at enemies and aggressively hug them while mashing click. This allows you to punch so fast that anything that doesn't get stun locked is unlikely to get more than a weak hit off on you. This is an intended feature. What can I really say about something like this? It almost speaks for itself, doesn't it? Beyond this game-breaking combo system, the primary issue is that fights feel more like an exchange of blows rather than tests of timing, skill, or adaptation. It comes down to rushing damage and exploiting stuns more than anything else. There is little variety to the enemy moves. They only have a couple attack animations, never block, and won't perform anything interesting like a counterattack. It doesn't help that if you don't speed kill them, they're just gonna wail on you with nigh undodgeable attacks. Sure, there's a block button, I'm just not sure what it's blocking other than my view. I think blocking may literally be broken because it doesn't seem to do anything. For the record, there's no parrying or any mechanic like that. It's simply better to fist dudes instead of bracing for a fisting. Aside from the axe-wielding enemies, it's typically hard to die in melee combat, so it's not like you have a genuine incentive to learn the ins and outs of melee beyond the combos, in quotes. So in other words, most of your melee combat abilities, especially blocking and directing your strikes, are shockingly pointless. And while there are three different melee weapons, the padlock, the valve, and the axe, the first two are the exact same weapon with a different model. And the axe? Well, the motion sickness hits harder than the hypothermia, let alone the axe itself. I cannot use this axe for the life of me. Everything about it lines up so badly. The ridiculous attack delay, its weird hit detection, your perspective taking a detour to the South Pole, you name it. Look at what Condemned does. The only illness that axe is inflicting is splitting headaches. Oh, and since you always have all three of these melee weapons, you ultimately have three weapons that fulfill the exact same role. That's just weak arsenal design, and that's not even the end of it. There's another 2/3 of the arsenal I need to talk about. The gun combat honestly fares even worse. In a vacuum, Cryostasis actually has a surprisingly well realized and satisfying arsenal. They look good, sound oomphy, and are smoothly animated. Enemies have some good looking feedback for getting hit, often staggering and shimmering a vivid orange like they're in a TV commercial for headache ointment. I wouldn't necessarily say fights transform the environment, but there's an above average level of chaos and environmental feedback from gunfights. I also adore the unique ammo counters, which are 3D rendered instead of being a purely 2D HUD element. They give a visual assessment of how many magazines you have and how many bullets you have left in your current magazine. It's a small thing, though it's a fun bit of flavor and immersion. This all seems good so far, right? Well, paradoxically, when you're actually using these guns in combat, something is blatantly wrong. Cryostasis has a ludicrously nasty problem with both hit detection and weapon accuracy. It feels like most of my shots either pass straight through enemies or go absurdly wide. Enemies are also tanky, so it's typically unclear if they just soak up a lot of lead, if your shot randomly took a left turn at Albuquerque, or if you just forgot to select firearms as a major skill in character creation. Yet the combat somehow falls into two extremes of enemies either just melting before you or them walking away unfazed by an entire magazine. It is unreal. My best theory is that they intentionally made the weapons inaccurate and unreliable for realism purposes. In this game where you shrug off gunshots because you're warm. I don't mind some realism compromises, but this is sloppy.
can take it. I can take it.
Here's my it.
As for the arsenal itself, there isn't as much to say as usual. There are several rifles, all of which serve similar roles. The Mosin Nagant, for instance, is the most damaging per shot and accurate weapon in the game, which means it has a 50% chance of hitting the broadside of a barn. It also has an absurdly long reload, which sucks because in the Arctic you never want to be caught with your pants down for numerous reasons. You also get an SVT-40, which is just a Mosin if it was faster but sucked harder otherwise. I do not like this thing. It feels like the most unwieldy and inconsistent weapon by far. Beyond close range, you'd have better luck hitting a Nat's wiener with a Nerf gun. Oh, but maybe you want mediocre long-range accuracy in this extremely claustrophobic and close-quarters game. Well, the scoped Mosin is here for you. Yeah, I don't know what the design intent here was. Cryostasis did come out in the era where sniper rifles were popular in shooters, so maybe it's for marketing. The scope is really disorienting, though I do like how it's rendered at all times. It came in handy twice, that's it. It's such a strange inclusion. It says a lot about the general visual and sound design that these weapons with the accuracy of an internet personality test still manage to feel good to shoot, even if the combat is otherwise unpleasant. There's also a double-barreled flare gun, which is a rare design. Its ammo counter is confusing, as it made me think it was a revolver at first. It's not useful, it deals damage over time, but mostly to the frame rate and not enemies. You can heal a tiny bit off the flares, so I guess that's a thing. Then there's a PPSH-41. Hilariously, I found this to be the most consistent weapon on offer, though knowing to use it like a shotgun certainly helps. It's a bullet hose that handles like your character can barely hold it. Looking down the iron sights makes it seem like there's an earthquake going on, and for whatever reason it has burst fire-esque functionality where it still fires after you let go of the trigger. I don't know why. At least it pumps out great damage and stun locks enemies. Shortly after you get it, ammo for it may as well start growing on trees or whatever the Arctic equivalent of a tree would be. It's probably my favorite weapon, mostly because it's honest about its utility and accuracy. Sure, you'll miss point blank shots with it, but it's still rapid wall lead. Rampaging with this thing was the most fun I had with the combat by far, so it's a shame it takes so long to appear. Finally, there's the water cannon. It's almost like a reverse flamethrower, converting icicles into a steaming hot jet of water. A cool idea for a weapon and a clever way to integrate the environment as a form of ammunition. It gets the job done, though it's obviously intended to be used against melee enemies or as a fallback weapon. My biggest issue is its oddly pitiful off-center particle stream, which makes it hard to gauge its range and where the stream is landing. As it turns out, this is a victim of me disabling physics. Oh well. It's the weakest flamethrower on my channel so far, but it still serves its niche and is easy to keep stocked up, so I'll give it a passing grade. The streak continues. Enemy design is also pretty standard fare. It's mostly just varying ranks of melee and gun enemies and a couple monsters that you need to dismember to kill. Oddly, the hardest enemies in the game are the dudes who use axes or Mosins, who are mostly concentrated in the early mid-game. Later on they use the PPSH, which sucks in their hands. This has the funny effect of making the later levels easier than the early levels. On top of that, melee is balanced parabolically, if that makes any sense. It's incredibly weak in the middle portion of the game, but strong in the early and late portions. You can charge down to dudes who wield PPSH-41s and only come out a wee bit colder. Sure, the guys gun-zerking them seem dangerous, but they're nothing in comparison to a point-blank PPSH magazine or nice clean sideways combo fisting. They're intended to be the endgame enemy, but I never found them threatening. Cryostasis is largely easy and just has some sporadic cheap shots and exceedingly rare difficulty spikes. There are no difficulty options, so this is the difficulty. I'd take easy janky combat over hard janky combat, but the absence of options is strange. And there really isn't much to Cryostasis' AI. I already suggested that there's minimal variety to the melee enemies. They charge you down, roll around, occasionally attack, and that's about it. Enemies who use guns will basically just act as turret emplacements, though they sometimes dodge roll your crosshair like they're fish who can roll. Gunfights are often horribly stagnant peek and shoot affairs as a result. On rare occasion, you'll get the best of both worlds, and an enemy with a gun will slowly chase you when they can't see you. Otherwise, it is simple, extremely absent-minded AI with no surprises up its sleeve. Their pathfinding is also bad in that early 2000s game way, where it'll take oddly roundabout routes through any room more open in a corridor. Basically, it's standard Eurojank shooter AI. This doesn't hurt Cryostasis too badly, owing to its corridorous level design and kinda clumsy combat. It's still another drop in the bucket. Altogether, I feel as though Cryostasis has subpar combat. Not necessarily awful or game-ruining, but it leaves a lot to be desired. The low weapon variety, terrible AI, lack of interesting combat encounters, and absurd underlying awkwardness all constantly taint it. Usually a good combat loop is important to me. When my guns in a shooter feel like they create man-shaped outlines around my enemies, I'm naturally gonna get a bit frustrated. I'm also gonna get a tad frustrated when melee combat feels like I'm greased up and drunk trying to fight other greased up drunk guys, with there being just as much finesse and reflexes on display as there is in real greased up drunkard brawls. So it says a lot about how good many other aspects of Cryostasis are that I'm not being more brutal on it for this. Well, the puzzles can suck too, but that's a given for most janky games. Cryostasis is a game begging for its combat to be more finely tuned. That alone could potentially propel it among my all-time favorite games, but this is what we got, and I feel that it brings the whole experience down quite a bit. It's not even something you can easily overlook, as it's close to a third of the game's content. Alright, I'm gonna start talking story spoilers. Click on the timestamp on screen to just skip to my conclusion. You cool? Okay, let's ice this game. To reiterate, the story mostly focuses on what happened on board the Northwind long before our protagonist, Nesterov, visits it. The ship's captain is a deuteragonist, as he is the person most directly responsible for the events of the game. The story is largely told from the perspective of crewmen in mental echoes and flashbacks, with the most important flashbacks falling to First Officer, Chief of Security, and Chief Engineer. Much like the captain, they are never given names. Most of these characters question or attack the captain's leadership since he grounded the ship taking a perilous route through the Arctic. Their discouragement resulted in the captain deciding to take extreme action, causing him to try forcing the ship out of the ice by ramming the surrounding ice. This failed, ultimately resulting in the ship's nuclear reactor detonating, which mutated the crewmen into the enemies you fight in the present. Despite all of these characters having a hand in dooming the ship, Cryostasis does not have a villain or single force to blame these events on, and nobody acted especially unreasonably in their situation. They're stuck in the Arctic Circle trying to survive or escape a worsening situation. Despite none of them getting very much screen time, Cryostasis establishes the motivations behind the major characters' actions very well. In fact, it's rather empathetic for a game where he killed nearly every living thing he crossed paths with. Succeeding in the mental echoes usually has you committing an altruistic or cooperative act of some kind, and they rarely ask you to perform violent acts. The few times they do require you to kill something, it's to save someone else's life. You're saving the crew from the selfish or cowardly acts that originally killed them, and that's the primary theme of the game. Helping each other and showing common decency was ultimately all that was necessary to save the crew of the ship. Well, I don't know what's going on with the polar bear, or the guy who got blasted in the face with glass. I'm not sure what the message is in those. That aside, shifts in the storyline occur as you complete the mental echoes. Most notably, one mental echo asks you to save a helicopter with most of the important characters on board. Whether or not they survive that is left ambiguous, but it comes back into play later on in the story. I respect Cryostasis for not pulling any weird timeline trickery. It's surprisingly easy to follow the story on top of it being well written. In addition, you infrequently find fragments of Gorky's story, Danko's Flaming Heart, which I mentioned much earlier. It's supposed to mirror the story of the captain and his relationship with the crew, acting as a bit of foreshadowing that is gonna make a deadly mistake trying to regain their respect. That's about the extent of that. Oh, bleh, I've been doing actual vague story analysis for once. I feel sick. Pretend I didn't say any of this. For its final act, Cryostasis suddenly whips something out of left field. Kronos, the god of time himself, suddenly decides to rise out of the hull of the ship. I guess time traveling all willy-nilly attracted some attention. Kronos is the final boss, and naturally he is wildly different than everything prior. I had to Google a walkthrough to figure out what the fuck was happening. Thankfully, Bronos is a forgiving guy with a lot of time on his hands, so you can infinitely repeat the fight until you win. No need to stare at a loading screen or anything like that. Basically, you're dueling Kronos to reach 10 points first. You have an arcing explosive bolt you can shoot, which one-shots enemies if it lands close enough. Kills grant a point and spawn a refill of this bolt that circles around the arena and is dreadfully fussy to pick up. In the meantime, you have to watch out for enemy melee swipes, Kronos' attacks, and his ability to subtract a point from you with his own bolt. Also, you're effectively stuck on weird circular rails for this. I don't know what's happening there. This is the final boss, and it's a baffling, chaotic mess that only a game like Cryostasis would think is an apt conclusion. Anyways, beat him and he offers you the opportunity to undo what happened to the Northwind. People say Cryostasis has multiple endings, but in reality it has a single ending where you get to choose how you want to obtain it. You get to possess either the Chief of Security, Chief Engineer, engineer or first officer. You revisit a previous scene as them and make a different choice than what they originally made. No matter which of the three you pick, the outcome is the same. The ship and its crew are saved. All it took to save the ship was one different decision. It then cuts back to Nesterov's perspective from the start of the game, but instead of falling into the ice pit, he is saved by the captain, where they then stroll back to the ship. We did it, Patrick. We saved the city. I guess nobody's a violent snowman now? I suppose I didn't expect this game to have a sort of happy ending like this. It's a satisfactory story, even if it is a bit too slow at some points. Story isn't usually the reason I play games, but it kept me going more than usual here. I did like the gradual unearthing of the mystery and the end twist with Kronos. The story isn't overly pretentious or preachy like a lot of similar games can be, and it isn't hard to follow even in spite of it changing as you time travel. There were unexplained little tidbits, particularly the intro implying that Nesterov time traveled himself back to life, but I guess it's fine to leave some questions behind. I can safely say it's a fairly well written story and maybe the best time travel story I've ever witnessed. I have nothing but praise for the story. It's a huge party experience. Now let's wrap this up. Cryostasis is truly a hidden gem. It is a weird, wild, brilliant game that is absolutely worth a shot, assuming you can even acquire it, and run it, and play it at a respectable frame rate, and get past the first level without crashing to the desktop a dozen times. On top of being abandonware, it's a technical nightmare, so even if you are absolutely aching to play it, it's a total gamble whether it will work or not. That is the shame of Cryostasis, it is so inaccessible. That's probably why it's become so forgotten over the years, despite there being a lot that makes it stand out. If you are interested in playing Cryostasis at all, then I would highly recommend it. The visual and sound design punch far beyond their weight class, the atmosphere is almost unparalleled, the story is well told, and it's simply a memorable experience overall. It's a rare case where I am willing to largely overlook the obnoxious puzzles and the subpar shooting in a first-person shooter. There's almost no other game like it, and it tickled a very specific Eurojank action horror FPS craving for me. Plus, Arctic horror is a specific subgenre that deserves more love. I'm not going to be forgetting Cryostasis anytime soon, and even though it was a rough ride, I'm really glad I got to play through it. I sincerely hope to see it return to stores, maybe even get a patch to improve the stability and frame rate. That's probably wishful thinking, but I guess you never know. I suppose that's all for this episode. Tune in next time for a terrible Call of Duty clone that I've been procrastinating on. I'll see you then.